Well, friendly greetings and a warm hello. This is my first time at Libertopia. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to, I guess I get some kind of an award at my free rubber chicken dinner tomorrow night. So I might abbreviate what I'm going to say now and cover some more fun things tomorrow. But let me start off. I've been watching this crowd while I've been among you here. And I've got to ask a question. It's going to be an embarrassing question for somebody here, but I want to make it as little embarrassing as possible. As some of you might have suspected, you're on the watch list of the powers that be. And I've identified an individual in this audience who's here under false pretenses from a government agency. And I'd like you to identify yourself now. Save yourself some embarrassment. So stand up, no harm done, but just let everybody know. Come on. This is very interesting, because once again I was watching the audience, and some of you were looking around to see who the person was. Those of you who weren't looking around are suspect. But nobody stood up. I first tried that coup when I was at a rather sketchy, rather iffy tax haven conference in the Cayman Islands some years ago. And I actually said that, and not one, but two people stood up. And I'm not kidding you. And I've used it occasionally since then. But government agents usually do have to identify themselves. So I'm gratified to see it, but I'm disappointed in the Black Riders of Mordor. So what I want to do is tell you how I became a libertarian, partially. I want to tell you where I think the society is going to go over the next few years. And maybe tomorrow I'll tell you what I think you ought to do about it. But let me just start out. I'll tell you my political pilgrim's progress. I remember this very distinctly. When you look back into your early childhood and see what you can remember and what you can't remember, one of the first things that I can remember was when I was about 7 years old. And I grew up in Chicago. And for some reason, my mother took me someplace in Chicago through a bad area. A lot of black people living in slums. And being a suburban kid, I was kind of shocked. I thought it was terrible that these people were living in dumps. And you know what I said to my mother? I said, this isn't right. I'm a 7-year-old kid. I was a precocious 7-year-old kid. But I said, isn't there something that you can do about it? And she didn't quite say, well, write your congressman. But I got the idea that I ought to write a letter to President Eisenhower. And my mother took down what I said, and she typed it up, and she sent a letter to Eisenhower. And I knew even then, at 7 years old, that there was something wrong with what I asked her to do. But she did it. Now, I don't have any political memory from there until I'm in high school. In between there, that time when I was 7 and wrote a letter to Eisenhower, and when I was in high school, I don't remember much about my political evolution. I only know that I never liked authority. And I always felt when somebody asked me, hey, you got a problem with authority? My answer would always be something like, no, I just don't like people telling me what to do. And that's about the extent of my evolution at that point. But it went beyond that. The first thing that really happened to me was when I was in high school, and I read Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative. A lot of the things in there made sense, and I figured I must be a conservative. And then my next step after that was, after I got out of college, or the last year I was in college, I read Ayn Rand's Virtue of Selfishness. And I remember that clearly. It's one of those maybe dozen things in my intellectual development that are burned like a diamond in my forehead. I read the first book of the first page of A Virtue of Selfishness, and I had to put it down. I said, I can't believe somebody has actually crystallized everything that I've always intuitively believed, but had not been able to formulate. So at that point, shamefully, I became a Randite because it made so much sense. Then, the next evolution was when I was in my 20s and I went on a treasure hunting expedition, a real one, with a big boat and everything for 3 months. And one of the books I brought along with me was a book called The Market for Liberty. It's written by the Tannehills, mostly Morris, I guess. And it was a defense of anarchism, but never once in that book did they use the word anarchy, which is one reason why it was probably such an effective defense. It explained how an anarchic society would work. But here's an interesting thing. Only 500 copies of that book were printed. It was like a samizdat. But later on, the boat sank and my book went down with it and so forth. But then, in 1979, I wrote a book called Crisis Investing. And it was #1 on the New York Times list for 19 weeks. And I did all these television shows and so forth. And so, I think it was Andrea Rich got in touch with me because I'd been promoting the book in the bibliography of my book, and they got hundreds of calls and letters. Where can I get this book, Market for Liberty? And so they asked me to write the foreword for the book, and they asked Carl Hess, who many of you probably know who he is, to write the introduction for it. So it was kind of like a Back to the Future kind of thing where I got to write a foreword for the book that changed my life, which is kind of not usually the way it works. But that wasn't good enough to become an anarchist, in my opinion. My next step was to become a Discordian. And a lot of you here will know what a Discordian is. I can sum up Discordian philosophy for you very briefly. And it's this: the whole of the law shall be do as thou wilt, but be prepared to accept the consequences. So that's where I am. I've taken a step from growing up in a cannibalistic death cult, Catholicism, to thinking I was a conservative and then thinking I was a Randite, and even anarchism isn't good enough. So that's where I am right now. It's a funny thing, though, because I met Ayn Rand just a few months before she died, actually. I was invited to a party where she was the featured, she was the guest of honor, obviously. And I found her charming, warm, very much unlike the way I guess she really is, or was. But after the party, I went out with about a dozen of her acolytes, and it turned into a real clusterfuck, because I was already a Discordian, and these people were clearly co-religionists, where anything that Rand said was dogma. So we didn't get along very well, and it's very interesting about the Randites. It's that it really is a secular religion, much like Marxism. It's funny, I was on a radio show with some guy named Yaron Brook. I remember his name because, once again, I don't argue with people. It's pointless to have arguments with people. You present your point of view, and you listen to the other person's, and you respond to it. That's all I was doing. But this guy who runs the Ayn Rand Institute or something like that, he just went wild. And it's like he became a lifelong enemy of mine because I was like a heretic, which is further proof that that's just a religion. Anyway, that kind of leads me to talking about philosophy. And I know this is Stefan's big thing, but to me, talking about philosophy is a little bit pointless. Nobody really cares about philosophy in general, but they do care about the two areas of practical and applied philosophy. Now, what might those be? Well, they're the two things you're never supposed to talk about in public: religion and politics. Those are the practical and applied areas of philosophy. So people talk about philosophy in general, but they'll never talk about philosophy in particular. When I'm in the US, which is less and less these days, I generally live in Aspen, Colorado, which is a very interesting subculture of a town. And I used to get invited to parties there. I never get invited to parties there anymore because after talking about the weather and the state of the roads and baseball scores, that's good for 5 minutes. Now what are you going to talk about? Well, I like to talk about important things. I like to talk about philosophy. Practical applied philosophy. What is that? That's religion and politics, the two things you're never supposed to talk about in polite company. So this is why I'm rapidly becoming an ex-Aspenite at this point, because I can't talk to anybody there. It's one of the nice things about groups like this. So, politics. It first started seeping into my brain that it was pointless trying to make any political changes in this country when in 1980, when my second book, Crisis Investing, was #1 on the list. And of course, in those days, some of you will remember, Phil Donahue's show was as big or bigger than Oprah was until recently. So I had the singular good luck to be on Donahue's show all by myself for an hour the day before the national elections when Carter and Reagan were running against each other. So Phil's a very smart guy. And we were talking, and the elections were the very next day, and this was live. And so I said something unkind about Carter and whatever, and he said, "Oh, then you're voting for Mr. Reagan." And I said something even more unkind about Reagan, because Republicans are more dangerous than the Democrats. They're more dangerous because they, on the surface, sound like free market people. Well, they're not, of course. They definitely don't believe in social freedom, and they say they believe in economic freedom, which turns people off. Well, at least the Democrats, I've got to say, at least they actually do have a core philosophy, and they actually do believe in collectivism. The Republicans do too. They aren't honest enough to come out and say it. They're hypocrites, and I hate hypocrites. Anyway, so after I said something unkind about Reagan, Phil said, then you must be a libertarian. You're voting for whoever the libertarian candidate was. I don't remember, it doesn't matter, in 1980. And at that point, the audience, like the mob they were going back and forth, liking what I said, hating it, back and forth. They really disliked it when I told them, even back then, that it's the worst allocation of time and money you can possibly make sending your kids to be corrupted by going off to college. They really didn't like that. But I'll tell you what they liked even less. They liked even less when I started to give them the 5 reasons why I wasn't voting for the Libertarian the next day, and why the mob shouldn't vote at all. So the eyes of the audience widened on me. I could see this because I was watching them. And I started to give them the 5 reasons you shouldn't vote. I started out by saying, first, it's immoral, because the whole political system is corrupt. It's based upon force and coercion, and it's immoral for you to participate in it. Well, no reaction really, because they're not used to hearing the word morality used from somebody that's not wearing a black suit with one of those little collars. Then I got to the second point that I was going to make. It's that it just gets your name into another government computer bank. You're identifying yourself further to the government. The third reason I gave them was that it just encourages them. Nobody with any sense is actually voting for one of these jerks. They're voting against the other guy. But the guy they wind up voting for thinks it's actually a vote for him. So it just encourages them, and it keeps the system going. The audience is getting restive. I got to the fourth reason, was it's degrading to you as a human being to stand around a government office, to identify yourself, to vote, hang around the kind of people that do this type of thing. And I could not get to the fifth and most important reason that you shouldn't vote, which is your vote doesn't count. It counts about as much as a grain of sand on the beach. And I didn't even get from there to saying, anyway, it's not who votes that counts. It's like Stalin.